that's where we're at. Now, the interesting thing about this, too, is that after all this, after all the problems with this bill, we know the distribution of the tax cuts go more to the wealthy than anybody else. We know the cuts go to the poor more than anybody else, Medicaid, SNAP. We know that it also messes with AI regulation in the states. I don't know how they squeeze that into the reconciliation bill. Maybe that'll get stripped out in the Senate. The other thing is it blows up the deficit to the point where it's now clear it could trigger sequestration, which involves more cuts to all of these programs across the board. I am old enough to remember just 10 short years ago when the deficit was the most important thing in the world to Republicans. It was the most important thing. Now, I will say this, the bond markets, there's a reason why Moody's came out and lowered the
U.S. credit
rating. And it's because they are concerned about these tax cuts. Because if you make these tax cuts permanent, there's one thing that's for sure. At one point, people are going to need services and people are going to be pissed and they're going to vote people out. And it's in many ways much easier to get these services back than it is to up tax cuts. And at least from the perspective of bondholders, whether they're correct or not, we become a far less safe savings mechanism because of these tax cuts. It is no coincidence that this rating agency announced it last week. There was nothing new about last week. We were further out from the tariffs. The tariff, I mean, if they were only talking about the tariffs, they would have said something 2 weeks ago.
Right.
They are trying to inhibit this bill from passing. They're doing it quietly, and they're saying, things don't look good with this teed up like this.
Well, also because if it explodes the deficit, that might, in theory, if the collectors come calling, it's going to be harder for the U.S. government to pay it back.
I don't think that we're worried about the collectors coming calling as much as, although that's possible, but people just not wanting our debt anymore. Right. And understand that, that rating in and of itself makes the debt that much more expensive.
Yep.
And Moody's has the ability to change that. They could.
That's a good point.
They could reward, good action as well. But what's amazing to me about this is that the desperation for Republicans to cut taxes, even if the deficit increases, and a reminder, the vast majority of tax cuts go to those in the top 10% and smaller in this country.
Yeah, to quote Stephen A. Smith, they don't care. They don't care about those deficits. What are we talking about here? All right, let's take a look. Cut taxes, even if the deficit increases. Look at this. 60% overall say, cut those taxes, baby. What about Republicans? They're the ones who are supposedly so concerned over the deficit. But even there, 74% say cut taxes, even if the deficit increases. Both overall and Republicans, they don't care. They don't.
Can we just pause on they're supposed to be the people who care about this piece of received wisdom that he repeats there, because that's not the observation that's ever been true in my entire life. They've blown up the deficit every single time they've been in power.
Oh, no. They supposedly care about the deficit. They complain about it. But if you look at it, it's Republican administrations that blow up the deficit.
Yes. Yeah. Because
every time.
Because they cut taxes and then there's less revenue. That's how it works.
Every time they do that. Now, I will also say there's been a lot of deficit hawkery on the Democratic side. Yes. In certain pockets. But the Republicans, that was like their fiscal prudence and responsible with money. And I'm socially liberal, but I'm conservative economically.
It's like the way populists...
What the F does that mean? I mean, it's all just BS.
It's like how populists say they care about Poland, except all those polls.
But even there, 74% say cut taxes, even if the deficit increases. Both overall and Republicans, they don't care. They don't care. In fact, the only ones who do seem to care are, in fact, Democrats. 55% of Democrats are opposed to cutting taxes if the deficit increases. But when it comes to Republicans, we're talking 3/4, the overall public 3/5. They don't care. They say cut those taxes, even if the deficit increases.
You know, it's interesting because I've been around this politics game for a long time. And there are people in this business who will tell you when push comes to shove, voters never really care about deficits. But the polls and the data here show something a little different.
Yeah, this was something I think that came to a little bit of a surprise to my dear friend standing on the other side of your screen, Mr. Berman. Take a look here. Okay, cut taxes even if the deficit increases. Now, you know, it's that 60% we spoke about. But back in 1996, the real last time where there really was a movement to bring that deficit down, bring that debt down, it was just 23% who said cut taxes even if the deficit increases. So we've nearly seen a tripling, far more than doubling of the percentage of Americans who say that we should cut those taxes even if the deficit increases. And that's where we're standing right now, basically, amongst the American public. And why I think that this movement to basically try and, you know, close down Trump's big, beautiful bill by making the argument that the deficit would increase, why will basically probably go nowhere at the end of the day, because the bottom line is voters overall and Republican voters especially say we want to cut those taxes even if the deficit increases, which is far, far different from where we were back in 1996 when, of course, Bill Clinton was president and we had a Republican House and a Republican Senate really trying to bring that deficit down.
Well, you bring up Clinton. You know, I was alive during the Clinton presidency. You barely so. And they actually had a budget surplus for like a minute there. But that didn't mean the national debt went.
Okay, incidentally, the budget surplus for like a minute, and it caused a small recession, incidentally. Just FYI.
Worth noting.
Worth noting. But what I think it's, you know, what the question I'd like to see is cut taxes even if you kick 10 million people off of Medicaid. That is really the operative question. And it's also just sort of like indicative of how lost the Democrats have been in how much they have run from the question of taxes in this country. Because they're just so afraid of the idea of talking about taxes and explaining you know, what taxes are and why they're important and what you get out of society. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Is there more to that? No. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.